something called the Rogers Curve. My background is community development, community work, primarily, well, almost exclusively in the communities that are made up of the people, frankly, that Ellie was providing a statistical profile of. And I think what's interesting about the Rogers Curve is that it is scalar. It will work at a population level, and it has a great deal of credence at a more localized community level. So people who are involved in local things, friends of the local park and that kind of thing, reaching out, wanting to engage with people, this hopefully will have some influence and some bearing on them as well. And apologies for a bored 13-year-old who's been sort of wandering around and just got out of bed. His mum's away for the weekend. Let me just... Okay, so Rogers Curve was developed at Iowa State University in 1957. It's been around a long time by these three gentlemen. Originally applied to agriculture in a very farming context. Rogers sort of took it further, hence he gets the credit with a name, in his book Diffusion of Innovations, about later applications of new ideas and technologies and their take up on a broader societal level, so beyond agriculture and farming. And I put out a short thread on Twitter, as I'm prone to do from time to time, motivated by a particular tweet. I'm not going to say who it was, but we've seen any number of these sorts of references. And I think one of the biggest impacts of the pandemic on the movement more broadly has been the lack of more authentic interaction and debate, and the whole kind of sort of echo chamber of Twitter. I don't think has done it a great deal of good over the last few months, and hopefully we can get back to debating things more in person. But this notion that Wales looks, this was the final paragraph of this tweet, what Wales looks like post-India is for all people to decide only then. And it strikes me as a very impractical, quite naive perspective to take. And I think there's a question that's been posted in the chat already in relation to, how do we appeal to the people living in poverty to get on board and to help with some of the heavy lifting of persuading others, if we're not going to give them any sort of sense of what the future looks like. And on that basis, I'm kind of minded to draw on the great late Raymond Williams, who was born in Pandy 100 years ago next month. His centenary of his birth starts next month, and as an aside is worth getting involved in if people are interested in Williams. To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. This position to me doesn't feel like it's hopeful. It doesn't suggest to me that there is something to look forward to. It's trust us. It's well, we can cross that bridge when we come to it. And I think we've seen the scale of the problem thanks to Ellie's rather sobering presentation. And though, how many times do we have to keep hearing these statistics? That the future feels quite far away for people living in poverty and the people who are affected by it. And I think the point around the corrosive nature of it of poverty as a social relation, I think is really, really powerful. Poverty isn't something that just happens to other people. It has an impact on other aspects and elements of society. So I put something out where I sort of rather flippantly, I'll hold my hands up, equated that notion of deciding in the future what to do with independence as going to the airport and then deciding where to go on holiday. It seems to me to be just impractical, rather naive, almost a little bit anti-intellectual as well. I think there's a danger that it feels like it's running away from some of the harder debates, discussions, and truths that need to be had and revealed. So the Rogers Curve essentially talks about 5 stages, and I'm going to fly through these. More than happy to maybe spend a bit more time on another occasion with this. Innovators, early adopters, early majority, late adopters, and laggards, and I'll make links with these back to some of the earlier presentations where possible. If this feels a bit abstract in terms of language, if it feels a little bit jargony, consider this. That in any number of behavioural studies and also of studies of people in actual incidents involving in planes, where behavioural scientists have filled up a plane, it's on the tarmac with smoke, across, and it's very consistent the number of times this has happened, and also across countries, nationalities, cultures, languages, etc. It straddles all of those differences. There's a very, very consistent course of action taken by the passengers. 15% of people will act. They will act logically, they will act with a clarity of thought, and they will focus on saving themselves and maybe others and getting off that plane. 15%, 15% will panic. They will do things that perhaps aren't particularly constructive for themselves or indeed for other people, and could even be considered obstructive for helping people get off the plane. 70% sit there and do nothing. Someone eventually will take their lead from either the panickers or the actors, but 70% of people consistently in these behavioral studies and scenarios don't do much at all. So maybe that's a bit more of an easier concept to consider. So this is the curve. Don't worry too much about the words at the bottom. It's the titles and it's the percentages that are more important here. So as I said, I'm going to fly through these. So innovators form a very, very small percentage of an overall population. And so one thing to say is this: I'm not applying this to the Yes Cymru membership for reasons that will become very clear. This is more around general populations, the wider the populace. So innovators are risk takers. They may feel they have nothing to lose, or they have lots to lose, but who cares? They are educated to a high degree and they're very entrepreneurial. But in a political context, they form a fringe. They hang out in small groups, esoteric groups, discussing theories, philosophers, things like that. Maybe they hang out on these sorts of things on a Saturday morning online. I don't know, you can decide for yourselves. But these political innovators aren't your average members of a community or a population. They're not watching the latest TV series, reading the mainstream books and magazines, etc. They may even go out of their way to avoid those. They are disruptors, in a positive sense, though some people might view it as negative disruption. Very, very small, tiny percentage of a market, of a population. Early adopters, also risk takers, also educated, but much more leadership orientated. And this is a really key point than the innovators. If innovators try to lead, or when they lead, they have a tendency to confuse, to confound, to alienate, maybe make people feel a bit stupid. Very, very generally speaking, they're not necessarily people. Whereas the early adopters are. They are outgoing, they're popular, they're connected within their own communities. They are the organizers, the messengers, the doers. They are informed, they seek to be informed. They are confident in debate. They're confident as well in their beliefs. They're also confident, and this is another really, really key point in relation to, making this movement, making these messages appeal to a broader populace, including those experiencing poverty. Early adopters tend to be very confident in core messages, a handful of them. When innovators nurture mature ideas, early adopters are the ones that push it out of the nest, as it were. Now, Yes Cymru clearly has some of these on board. There are probably several early adopters here today. But in a population of 3 million, well, there's probably others out there that haven't got on board yet. So where we are on this curve, people will have their own view. The reality is, though, that we probably have more of these people still to get on board, still to find a role, still to invest some time and resource in. The early majority, less risk-taking, tend to be more conventional with their beliefs and their willingness to take on and accept new ideas. I have a worry that many of these people will have been put off in the last 12 to 18 months with some of the stuff they've seen on social media, and that's a concern. But these people really are worth fighting for. They give us a sniff of white line fever, if you like, in terms of the mathematics related to securing referenda, winning referenda, and so on. These people need to be won over. They do an awful lot of heavy lifting for the movement. They're active in their community, workplace socials, donate to charity, they fundraise, they volunteer, they sit on committees, they run fairs, fetes, all of those sorts of things. They're knowledgeable about social trends. And what is critical is that they have influence over their own neighbours, their own micro networks, their hyper-local localities, which in the course of the pandemic, people have probably been confined to much more than they usually are. So they have a particular value, I suppose, at the moment and sort of going forward as well in the short term. These people, though, tend to be pragmatists. They adopt things, innovations, ideas, when they feel comfortable with them. These people win over the ones and twos, like I said, really, really important. They're not afraid of change, but they don't necessarily go after it. They wait for change to come to them. Now, consider what we've been talking about with respect to poverty and what we've been hearing. It's deeply entrenched in many Welsh communities. And I'm not saying for one moment, let's be clear, that innovators cannot come from, and early adopters cannot come from disadvantaged communities, absolutely far from it. But it is reasonable to assume that with the poverty figures such as they were, and I think it was 700,000 that Ellie talked about living in poverty, a large number of those will form early and or late majority segments in the broader population. So go back to that tweet around, okay, let's decide what the future looks like only once we've secured that future, that independence, and that state of it. It's akin to asking people to jump over the wall without telling them what's going to be on the other side. Now, for those people that have the cultural, the social capital, financial reserves to be able to deal with the consequences of that, that's fine. But clearly, from what you have seen, people living in poverty have far, far more, proportionately speaking, if you like, to lose from taking those massive leaps of faith. So the late majority, usually much more traditional, usually a little bit more conservative with a small c, usually a little bit less educated, less socially active, maybe a little bit older. Change isn't fun for these people. And unlike the early majority, who let change maybe come to them, late majority people will try to evade it. They will try to hide from it. They will only push back when it begins to really kind of impose and threaten them and challenge a particular worldview. And so think back to those core messages that many of us as early adopters are quite confident in deploying and talking about. They won't work on the late majority. If they did, they wouldn't be in the late majority. They would be in the early majority. They'd be other early adopters like us. So we have to have more nuance in the message. And I'll come back to that in a bit. Laggards, won't spend too much time on these. They tend to be the most traditional. These people, rather than avoid change, will actively fight it, however. And that's what they are worth spending a little bit of time on. They will perceive as having a lot to lose. But these people are not remote, isolated and disconnected. They are connected in their community, though not necessarily in a way that encourages the sort of the transmission of ideas and innovation, but they have huge reservoirs, deep reservoirs of what's called bonding social capital to draw on, i.e. they mix among and have links with people like them, which mutually reinforces their worldview. Just consider these people's views on things like bilingual signs in Wales, an argument that was more or less 150 years ago, but is still irksome to some. It might be gay marriage. It might simply be just different COVID rules around masks between Wales and England. You presumably get the picture as to who these people are. There's very unlikely to be any laggards here today, but they are worth considering for two main reasons. They aren't worth the fight in a great majority of cases and instances. They sap energy, they sap effort, they sap time that is better spent on appealing to people in the early majority and to a certain extent the late majority. They also, this is more of a personal view, they also sap the fun out of the movement. Cast your mind back to the marches and how enjoyable they were, how much fun they were. We need to find the fun with this. They can be quite a joyless experience engaging with these people, but they can be resourceful, wealthy and connected. And while the innovators and the early adopters are by necessity courting the early majority, the laggards are extremely motivated in targeting the late majority. They are the buffer, if you like, for the laggards. They will deploy disinformation, scare tactics, the old tropes and cliches, too small, too poor, language Nazis, you name it. We all know them. They're well worn. They work, and that's why they keep deploying them. The key thing to remember when considering and applying the Rogers curve to our lived experience is that they aren't being deployed at us. Those of us who are on the left-hand side of this curve, whether we're at the far left of it or not, is irrelevant. They're not deployed at us. They are being deployed at the late majority. So what to do? The early adopters, so I think one of the key thing is that to recognize that all progressive social movements, civil rights movements, within the environmental movements, people are always lost along the way. People who were on board early always drift away. It's always happened and it always will. It always happens in progressive social movements that schisms occur. Why do we assume that Yes Cymru and the independence movement will be any different? And some of them won't go quietly. So we need to take that on the chin. It is a necessary step on the evolution of these movements. We need to be more nuanced in our messages. Take, for instance, the Six Nations and how popular the Welsh rugby team is through, is it February, March, April time, and the criticism of 80-minute patriots. Probably these people form the late majority. They need to be persuaded demonstrably of the benefits of change by patronising them and belittling them, particularly patronising something that they are particularly keenly interested in, will not work. So we need to be more nuanced in our messages. I'm not for a moment saying that Yes Cymru does that, but there's plenty of people probably within the membership who tend to get involved in that sort of baiting, if you like. The other thing to bear in mind is that poverty is exhausting. the lived experience of it is exhausting, and there's been some comments to that effect in relation to not having the time to cook meals, for example. And again, it comes back to the point that Ellie was making in the Lister quote around poverty, the shameful corrosiveness that it has in terms of social relations. What the middle class folk, no matter how well intended and do-gooding and everything else that we are, we have to recognise that poor communities aren't, and they still retain this. Even people I know who very left-intended, left-minded, nevertheless fall into some of the old tropes that poor communities and the people that live in poor communities are a bit feckless, they're permissive communities, they're apathetic, lazy, etc. Poverty is exhausting. What these communities do have, and this is where we talk in community development being more asset-based, is to recognise very fundamentally that disadvantaged communities have a rich, tightly woven community fabric of trusted networks of organisations. So in terms of winning these people over in very, very short short terms, to the cause, and to help with some of the heavy lifting, and to provide mechanisms and means of communicating and reaching other people in these communities, we have to work through these trusted networks that are in these communities. We cannot merely parachute in and then parachute out. We have to work through them, and we have to need to build alliances with them in the real world. And it's not just on social media, which probably is stating the obvious, but I think the way things have tended to be confined to social media in the last few months, for obvious reasons, I suppose, I think it's a point that's worth bearing out. And so, yeah, like I said, the sense that poverty is exhausting, and my final point is this: why would we be so arrogant? And I'm playing devil's advocate only to a small extent. Why would we be so arrogant to think that people in disadvantaged communities, the people living with poverty day in, day out, have the time and the focus to listen to us at the times that tends to suit us, that we take the messages to them, when it's such a grind all of the time, living in poverty, and a little bit more humility is required amongst us, the early adopters, those people who are taking out, the ones pushing the message out of the nest, and all the other terms and metaphors I've used. When we reach these people, is there to be a little bit more humility in it, irrespective of the statistics, is to be a little bit more nuanced and aware of what the lived experience is like. I've glossed over the intersectionality around communities of interest, communities of shared characteristics, communities of place. Now's not the time to go into that in any great detail, though I'm acutely aware of it all. But that's me done. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.